Long before the world knew the name Swarovski, before Hollywood gowns shimmered under spotlights, a young craftsman stood in a dim Bohemian workshop facing a question that would haunt him for years. Why did some crystals blaze with brilliance while others felt dull and lifeless? What happened next would pull him into a world of secrets, precision, and obsession. A pursuit so consuming, it would overturn an entire industry. A glasscutter built $1 billion crystal empire, and it all began with a single imperfect shard of glass. The spark no one expected. In 1892, in a modest workshop tucked into the Austrian countryside, a young glasscutter leaned over a curious machine assembled from scavenged gears, makeshift wiring, and a sputtering electric motor. When he flipped its switch, the device gave off a piercing metallic scream, so loud that neighbors rushed outside, convinced something had exploded. But nothing had gone wrong. That jarring noise marked the arrival of a breakthrough few could yet understand. Inside that box was the world's first electric precision crystal cutting machine, a device that would transform a quiet craftsman named Daniel Swarovski into the founder of a global luxury empire. He had no formal engineering education, no prestigious workshop, no access to elite capital. What he did have was an impatience with imperfection, a fascination with light, and the belief that crystal could achieve a level of brilliance no human hand could repeatedly create. The story of Swarovski, the brand that would one day dazzle Hollywood, haute couture, and millions of customers across the world, began with a single question. Could a simple craftsman reinvent an ancient art? The child who saw the world through glass. Daniel Swarovski was born in 1862 in Bohemia, a region long celebrated for its glassmaking traditions. Workshops dotted the countryside, each carrying forward skills handed down through families for generations. His father's shop was one of these places, a modest, bustling room where light bounced off half-finished ornaments in jars of crushed crystal. Daniel grew up in this environment. While most children spent their afternoons running through fields, he remained indoors, brushing crystal dust from the floor and watching the craftsmen refine raw glass into objects that shimmered under the morning sun. Even as a boy, he was fascinated by the small, technical mysteries of the craft. He examined how a simple shift of a wrist changed the way a facet caught the light, and why one piece looked vibrant while another, cut with similar care, appeared dull or uneven. What intrigued him most was the unpredictability. Two pieces could begin with identical shapes, yet emerge with different personalities. The outcome depended entirely on the steadiness of a craftsman's hand, his mood that day, or the subtle variations in pressure he applied. To Daniel, this reliance on human precision felt like a flaw. He respected the tradition deeply, but he wondered why brilliance had to hinge on the limits of muscle memory. That question followed him into early adulthood and came into sharp focus after he traveled to Vienna in 1883 for the first electricity exhibition. He wandered through the halls expecting little more than an interesting diversion. Instead, he encountered machinery powered by electricity that operated with an unprecedented steadiness. Motors ran without faltering. Tools maintained the same pace hour after hour, immune to fatigue or distraction. The demonstration struck him not simply as a display of innovation, but as a glimpse into the future of craftsmanship. If electricity could sharpen the consistency of tools in other industries, why couldn't it make glass cutting more accurate as well? Daniel returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. The exhibition had not handed him a solution, but it had revealed a path. Precision did not need to remain the exclusive domain of human skill. There was a way to systematize brilliance, and he intended to find it. A revolution takes shape in secret. Back in Bohemia, Daniel resumed working in his father's shop. But his thoughts had shifted entirely toward mechanization. He needed a place to experiment away from the eyes of traditionalists, so he set up a small workshop in the attic above his family's home. It was cramped and underlit, but it served as a refuge where he could attempt the impossible without interference. The idea of transforming a hand-guided craft into a mechanized process was controversial. Local guilds held enormous power, and their members viewed such efforts as a threat to their livelihoods. To them, mechanization was not progress. It was an affront to a skill honed through generations. Daniel knew that if word spread, he would face intense resistance. Silence became his greatest ally. He began gathering whatever components he could afford: gears from traveling merchants, bits of metal from local tradesmen, small motors purchased with carefully saved wages. He lacked formal engineering training, so he taught himself through disassembly, observation, and relentless testing. He experimented with torque and belt tension, studied the behavior of abrasive wheels under varying speeds, and kept meticulous notes on each result. Failures were frequent, and sometimes dangerous. Overheated motors filled the attic with an acrid smell. Belts snapped without warning. Grinding wheels cracked suddenly, sending shards across the room. Yet each setback revealed something useful: an overlooked adjustment, a flaw in the design, or a mechanical imbalance that needed to be corrected. Gradually, the machine began to take shape. It was neither elegant nor quiet, but it possessed a capability that startled even Daniel when he saw the first results. The facets it produced were remarkably consistent. The cuts were clean, the light refracted with a clarity he had never seen before. It was the first time he believed his vision could become more than a private experiment. Yet success created its own complications. In Bohemia, where tradition was treated almost as law, such a device would not be welcomed. The guilds depended on the exclusivity of handcraft, and mechanized cutting threatened to redefine the entire profession. Daniel understood that introducing his machine here would provoke conflict he could not win, so he made a decisive choice. Instead of fighting for permission, he packed up the prototype and left Bohemia. Austria offered an environment more receptive to industrial experimentation, and with the Alps providing abundant hydroelectric potential, it represented the perfect location for what Daniel intended to build. He crossed the border not as the head of a company, nor as a known innovator, but as a craftsman, seeking freedom to develop an idea that had outgrown the world that raised him. His next steps would mark the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the crystal industry far beyond anything he imagined. Wattens, the valley that became a kingdom. By the mid-1890s, Daniel Swarovski had outgrown the constraints of Bohemia. His machine was finally capable of producing cuts of astonishing uniformity. Yet he needed a place where electricity was not a privilege but a dependable resource. Industrial power grids were still in their infancy, and only a handful of regions in Europe could sustain continuous mechanical production. This search led him to Wattens, a quiet village in the Austrian Tyrol. It was not a place most entrepreneurs would have chosen. The valley was remote, tucked between rugged mountains and threaded by fast-moving glacial streams. But to Daniel, the landscape offered exactly what his invention required: a steady supply of hydroelectric power. The roaring alpine waters could turn turbines endlessly, giving him the mechanical consistency he had only dreamed of in his attic workshop. In 1895, he relocated his family and his prototype to this unlikely setting. There, he partnered with Armand Kosman and Franz Weiss, two men who shared his willingness to take risks on new technology. Together, they founded Swarovski and Company, laying the groundwork for an industry no one yet realized was about to transform. Daniel's ambitions extended beyond mechanization. If machines could cut with precision, then the crystal itself needed to be worthy of that precision. He began refining the chemistry of crystal production, experimenting with varying proportions of silica, potash, and lead oxide. Through years of testing, he developed a formula of extraordinary clarity, a material that refracted light more sharply and responded elegantly to the geometric cuts his machines could deliver. The specific additives he used were closely guarded, and the exact formula remains secret even today. The combined effect of superior material and mechanical accuracy was astonishing. Until then, crystal sparkled inconsistently. Brilliance depended on the artisan's touch, environmental conditions, and subtle irregularities in the glass. Daniel's process created crystals whose facets caught and scattered light with a repeatable, engineered intensity. Shine was no longer a matter of luck. It was a guarantee. The fashion world noticed almost immediately. Couture houses in Paris requested samples for embroidery experiments. Jewelers wrote letters asking for bulk quantities. Theaters looked to Swarovski for embellishments that would glow under gaslight, and later under the stronger beams of electric stage lamps. For the first time, costume designers could rely on crystals that behaved predictably on silk, velvet, and metal settings, allowing them to compose entire garments around the way light moved. Daniel had not merely refined an existing craft. He redefined the expectations of crystal itself. What emerged in Wattens was more than a product. It was the foundation of a new visual vocabulary in luxury. The emergence of a modern luxury language. The turn of the 20th century was a period of artistic upheaval. Fashion houses in Paris and Vienna were challenging traditional silhouettes, experimenting with new textiles, and searching for decorative elements that could elevate their designs beyond the limits of embroidery and metalwork. There was a growing appetite for materials that could capture movement, reflect light, and bring depth to a garment without weighing it down. Swarovski crystals arrived during this transformation like an unexpected gift to the industry. Designers who had long wrestled with inconsistent crystal quality suddenly had access to stones that were identical from batch to batch. Daniel's insistence on standardizing sizes, shapes, and refraction quality allowed artisans to build patterns with mathematical precision. They could sketch an idea knowing that every crystal ordered months later would match those used in the original sample. This reliability reshaped the possibilities of adornment. Soon the crystals traveled far beyond Austria. They appeared on gowns presented in haute couture salons along the Rue de la Paix. Royal courts commissioned pieces with elaborate crystal trims for balls and coronation events. Even military uniforms incorporated Swarovski stones in ceremonial attire, valuing their brilliance under torchlight. Then came the era of film. Hollywood, with its powerful spotlights, dramatic close-ups, and craving for visual excess, embraced Swarovski without hesitation. Costume designers realized that these crystals behaved unlike anything else on screen. Under intense lighting, they didn't merely twinkle, they produced a kind of controlled luminosity that cameras adored. They adorned Marlene Dietrich's gowns, adding depth to her famously sculpted cinematic persona. Marilyn Monroe's sheer body-skimming dress, the one she wore while singing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President," shimmered with thousands of Swarovski stones engineered to catch even the faintest movement. They enhanced Audrey Hepburn's accessories, giving understated elegance a new level of radiance. Across Broadway stages and Las Vegas revues, the crystals became essential components of performance, turning costumes into moving constellations. By this point, Daniel's quiet attic experiment had grown into an international design language. Swarovski crystals were more than decorative elements. They became symbols of glamour, craftsmanship, and a certain kind of radiance that audiences recognized instantly, even if they didn't know the name behind it. The company was no longer just supplying materials, it was shaping the very aesthetics of modern beauty, influencing fashion, film, jewelry, performance art, and even architecture. What began as a personal quest for precision had evolved into a global vocabulary of light. Innovation through war and uncertainty. Twice in Daniel's lifetime, Europe plunged into war. Both conflicts threatened to dismantle industries across the continent, including his own. Yet Swarovski survived by adapting. During World War I, the company shifted part of its production to tools and machinery, using Daniel's understanding of grinding processes to create equipment needed for agriculture and wartime industries. Flexibility became the company's lifeline. World War II presented greater challenges. Austria's political landscape changed dramatically under Nazi occupation, and many companies were forced into difficult positions. Swarovski once again switched production toward war-related optical components such as binoculars, rifle sights, and rangefinders, but never openly campaigned for the Nazi regime, choosing a pragmatic attitude that allowed it to protect its employees and preserve its independence. When peace returned, Swarovski focused once more on creation rather than survival. Crystal production resumed with renewed ambition, driven by the aesthetic renaissance of the post-war years. The world wanted beauty again, and Swarovski was ready to provide it. Unfortunately, Daniel Swarovski passed away in 1956, but his legacy was already deeply ingrained in the company's structure. His children and grandchildren inherited not just a thriving business, but a philosophy, precision, secrecy, and constant reinvention. Under their leadership, Swarovski expanded into new territories. The company ventured into lighting, producing magnificent chandeliers and architectural installations. It entered the jewelry market with its own collections, rather than simply supplying stones to other designers. Collectible figurines became a global phenomenon after the 1976 Winter Olympics, where a small crystal mouse captured public fascination. The brand also became synonymous with the couture world. Designers such as Christian Dior, Yves Saint Laurent, and Alexander McQueen incorporated Swarovski crystals into iconic collections that defined eras of fashion. As retail evolved, Swarovski stores began appearing in luxury districts around the world, offering consumers the chance to purchase jewelry and decorative pieces directly. A significant shift from the company's origins as a supplier. By the early 21st century, Swarovski had become not just a manufacturer, but a full-fledged luxury brand with its own identity, aesthetics, and global presence. The anatomy of a crystal empire. What ultimately propelled Swarovski to worldwide dominance was not the material alone, but the philosophy behind it. Daniel Swarovski understood that perfection in crystal cutting was not merely about beauty. It was about reliability. Designers could build entire collections around Swarovski stones because they knew every piece would be identical. That consistency created a level of trust that no other crystal manufacturer could match. Equally important was the idea that Swarovski never positioned itself as an imitation of something else. Instead of competing with diamonds, it established its own category. Swarovski crystal was not a substitute for gemstones. It was a luxury material in its own right. This vision allowed the company to move seamlessly between couture and consumer goods, from stage productions to home decor, from Hollywood costuming to mass-market retail. The company now spans high jewelry, fashion collaborations, optical instruments, lighting solutions, and architectural installations that transform entire buildings into works of crystal art. As of 2024, Swarovski's annual sales approached 1.9 billion euros. The company's crystal business, which covers jewelry, crystals, and accessories, sells its products through roughly 6,600 stores worldwide in some 150-plus countries. And as of the most recent reports, Swarovski employed around 16,600 people globally in the crystal business division. Yet even as its presence spans continents and industries, the core of the company remains tied to Daniel's earliest revelation: the belief that crystal could be elevated beyond simple ornamentation if one approached it with scientific precision and artistic imagination. It is uncommon for a craftsman to transform his field so completely. It is even more unusual for an idea conceived in a cramped attic to ripple outward until it reshapes the visual language of fashion, film, jewelry, and design. But Daniel managed exactly that. What began as a personal frustration, a refusal to accept that brilliance must depend on the fallible human hand, evolved into a technology that would redefine what crystal could be. Daniel Swarovski entered the world as a glass cutter. He left it as the architect of a billion-dollar crystal empire. If a single craftsman could reshape an entire industry with one idea, what other revolutions are still waiting to be cut into brilliance? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Until next time.